So hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining this session. And this talk will be about open source, and open source is open choice, right? So in this talk, I will give you a set of tools to help ease your decision about open source adoption, when you should do it, and practical tools that you can use to choose the right open source project for you. So first of all, hi, my name is Hila Fish. I'm a senior DevOps engineer and I work for Wix. I have 15 years of experience in the tech industry. I've recently joined the AWS Community Builders Program. I help co-organize conferences in Israel, where I live, DevOps Days Tel Aviv, and Statcraft Monitoring Conference. I'm a mentor in courses and communities. I also co-manage a Facebook community with offline meetups about open source in Israel, but we try to be as global as we can. I'm a DevOps culture fan. I think this is what helps companies achieve great things. And I'm a lead singer in a cover band, as I mentioned also before. It is a lot of fun. You can see a picture here, and I enjoy it very much. Okay, so let's dive right in. Open source software is publicly available, right, and can be modified at will, but of course you open a PR and you don't just merge domain. And the thing is that a lot of tools that we use in our day-to-day is open source. So React, Java, Firefox, Linux, right? So a lot of tools that we already use are open source, which is awesome to know. So in the late 90s, proprietary software was considered the standard, and the notion of making source code public was considered bad strategy for tech companies. And coming forward to 2020 and up to until now, the concept of open source became more and more mainstream. So what's so good about open source? Open source helps build a rich developer community because it is a society that is based on knowledge, but really relies on the core values of communication and collaboration to succeed. And Manish Sharma, who's the general manager of GitHub India, he said basically that open source is an enabler for innovation, and that businesses that turn to open source, it helps speed up their business transformation. So we see that also in the upcoming years, that open source is more and more adopted in companies and by individuals. So let's talk about open source and why is it good, right? So open source really boosts our code quality and security because, as Linus Torvalds said, the creator of Git and Linux, he said that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. So since a lot of people can review code because it's publicly available, then anyone can spot and correct errors and omissions. So if you don't only detect the issues, but also fix them, then the code will be in a much higher quality and secured, of course. And I want to share with you a bit about the open source community that I manage in Israel. It's called Pull Request, and we really try to incorporate and help people to contribute to open source as much as we can through workshops and stuff like that. And one of the initiatives that we have, that I lead in the community, is called Open Source Rel, so like DevRel, but for open source. And it's basically a way to showcase how companies perceive open source and how they actively contribute to this realm. So you can see that there are several companies that already featured in this initiative, my company Wix and other companies as well. If you want to showcase your company, you're more than welcome to reach out. In the end, I will have a slide with the contact details. And the thing why we did it is because we want to make sure that people know what companies are doing in this realm and how they actively contribute to open source, because that way, of course, it's a PR for the companies, but we're not doing it for that. We're doing it for, let's say I am a fan of open source, right? And I want the ability to know that if a company really believes in open source as well, maybe since we share the same values, maybe it will be good for me to work in that company. So in this way, we also think that we are able to boost open source adoption and activity in this realm. So that's why we do it, and we really hope that we will achieve this goal in the future even more. back to route. So open source also boosts code quality and security, that, as we said, but also adaptivity. So why do I mean by that? Adaptivity means that we have more users, right, that use in a certain open source project, which means more use cases, and then the code will be actually more robust. And the thing is that when it's adaptive to various use cases, it allows surfacing bugs and edge cases much more rapidly than traditional QA processes. And it also encourages more modularity, avoiding the one-size-fits-all assumption, resulting in greater flexibility and lower customization costs in the long run. Let's talk also about agility, right? So modern software development processes usually are followed in open source projects, which leads to rapid development cycles, which leads to more frequent releases without sacrificing quality. And we also have less bureaucracy, right? When you open a PR versus opening a commercial support ticket, it's a whole entirely thing. And there are no regularly scheduled release processes. So once we some release get out, it just get out and that's it, as opposed to a proprietary software where they have cycles that they need to follow. And I also put here some interesting read by Ben Balter from GitHub about open source adoption. I really encourage you to read it. It's very insightful. Okay, so let's talk about the DevOps perspective, right? So because usually open source is something that is more treated from the developer side and not the DevOps. So I wanted to share how we DevOps engineers perceive open source. But in order to understand that, let's cover first the developers aspect. So developers say, hey, we have functionality factors to consider. So will this code, will this library that I found, the open source one, get integrated in my code properly? And what efforts are needed to do so? As opposed to that, DevOps engineers, we have the environment factors to consider. So we look at that project and say how and will it will get integrated in my environment. And also we have other peripheral stuff to think about, like security and maintenance and stuff like that. Other than that, collaboration is a common ground between DevOps and open source. So every time I know that I have issues with some tool, I know that I can just open an issue and I have, and I assume good faith, and I know that people will help me because we want to collaborate, we want to help each other. And another thing is that collaboration leads to better conclusions and solutions. And when communities form around shared challenges, then the diversity of ideas that naturally emerges surfaces better solutions. And we all want better solutions because, again, the focus that we have is the environment, and we want the environment to be as stable and secured as possible. And also we treat open source as tools, and we ask ourselves, do we want to introduce this tool to this system because it will help us to deliver code or automate this or introduce a certain capability? So we can really be flexible with what we introduce to our system because integration is no strange concept for us. Most of us, the DevOps engineers, came from the background of system admins or system engineers. So we have like a way of integrating stuff to our environments. So that's why we just consider it as another tool to our tool chain, and we can just integrate it, and that's that. But of course, not everything is good and just positive. We have other things to consider, and since our environment stability is the most important thing, we are in a constant state of trade-offs and maintaining balance because we want to upgrade, right? Because maybe there are features that are good for our needs, but we don't want to rock the boat too much. And also the variety out there of projects is insane. There are a lot of things that are covered by open source projects, and we need to make sure that it is good and really suitable for our use case, but without rocking the boat too much. There are a lot of complexity as well, because if we take, for example, Jenkins, it has its plugins, and show me one person that is able to upgrade Jenkins or its plugins without having any fear of anything getting break. So we have really stability considerations to think about. So that's why we don't really rush into things. We always need to make note of what's important right now and what is important to the environment stability as well as its functionality. And in the middle of everything is research. We want to read about projects online and how they are used, because we want to make sure we know exactly what we introduce to our environment. Another thing, this is generally true for DevOps in general, but also for open source as well. We need to keep tabs and be informed of what's going on, because I will give you 2 examples. Let's say I have a tool that I found, version 1.0 is not really right for the system. The features is not really what I need. Maybe there's even a very big bug that I can't afford myself to introduce to the system. So maybe I can just wait out, keep tabs on this project, and then version 2.0 will be great for my use case, and the bug will get fixed by then, and stuff like that. So this is one example. And another example is CentOS. It reached end of life at the end of 2021. If I wasn't aware of that, I'm putting my systems at risk, because what does it mean to have end of life? No security patches getting released. So if I don't know about that, then I'm putting my systems at risk, which is not good, because all I care about is the environment stability. So that's that. And I really like this picture because, as you can see, it says keep moving people, even though nobody is there. So that's exactly the mindset that needs to be incorporated in our day-to-day. We need to keep tabs and be informed of what's going on without having our team leader breathing down our necks and asking us to do it. We need to do it ourselves. I think it also will help us be better engineers. Okay, so I talked about the DevOps perspective. Let's talk on when should we consider adopting open source in our environments. So when we have an uncommon use case, I can show you a story from one of my previous companies. We had application installed on Kubernetes, and this application didn't need to run all the time. It could only run in certain conditions. And at that time, we used Google Cloud, and Google Cloud allowed to downscale pods only to 1 and not to 0. And that's why we searched for a solution online and found Keda. Keda is an open source tool which allows exactly that downscaling pods to 0 based on certain conditions. It was awesome. It was also declared as production ready, which is good for me as the maintainer of the environment. So this is an example. When you have an uncommon use case, you can just search online for an open source that will cover this use case. Another thing is limited budget. So when your budget is limited and you can't really afford purchasing an enterprise license of the software, then you can use its free version or an open source alternative. And it will also allow lower total cost of ownership, because adopting open source software generally has lower cost because the software itself usually comes at no cost or relatively low cost, and shifts the cost center from licensing to customization and implementation. And also, we need to think about the fact that training and maintenance and support will be equally invested in an open source project adoption versus proprietary software. So, might as well boost open source adoption if no significant reason is preventing you from doing so. The next thing is when you have insufficient in-house resources, ability-wise, like this family guy right here, or capacity-wise, to create a solution of your own or enhance a solution. So you can just find an open source tool that covers your use case perfectly or almost perfectly. And the thing is that there's a saying, why reinvent the wheel, right? If there's an open source tool that already covers your use case, might as well just use it, and that's that. Okay, so I talked about the advantages of open source. Let's talk about some disadvantages as well when adopting open source projects. So first of all, security by obscurity. This notion doesn't apply on open source because proprietary software companies can claim that their code is more secured than open source alternatives because of that principle. And then it's harder for hackers to exploit loopholes since the code is not available. So this is something to think about. Prone to abuse, so it doesn't happen quite a lot, but I only have two examples to give you. So the npm package colors, where the maintainer added a loop in the code, is one of them. And another example is the Faker.js package, where the maintainer had a bankruptcy, if I'm not mistaken, and then he released a version that basically deletes the project entirely. So it could happen, and you can just say, yeah, I can just put the version in requirements.txt or package.json log, and that's it. But I think that if every company will do it, we wouldn't even hear about these two issues in that scale, because everyone will do it. And since we don't always do it, then it's still important to understand that it is prone to abuse. People like me and you are the ones to support open source projects. It's not always backed up by companies, so it is something to consider. Compliance. So in its raw form, open source usually gives no warranty or official guarantee, making it difficult to use in a business environment where compliance is a must. So it's also something to consider. Open source is not always free. We need to check the licenses carefully, especially if the reason why you choose this open source is because of a budget consideration. Discontinued projects. So as I said, not always the open source projects are backed up by companies. Sometimes they are backed up by people, individuals like me and you, and they can just decide they discontinue to support this project. So if you adopted this kind of project, it means that either you need to do a migration to another project or start maintaining this project yourself. So it's also something to consider. Support is not guaranteed. You should assume good faith, but as I mentioned, KEDA, once I started to use it and incorporate it in our environment just before it was fully production, we had some issues. I opened an issue about it in the GitHub repository. I think it was Thursday night or Friday morning, something like that. And I didn't assume that they will do this for me because I have the deadline, not them. But I explained the situation, and they were super nice and released the version for me with fixes for these issues. So it was awesome. So there is a need to assume good faith, but again, the collaboration is the foundation, one of the foundations of open source. So I can really think that you can assume good faith and it will work out. And the thing about proprietary software is that support is guaranteed, that you are guaranteed to get a support, but you're not guaranteed to have good support. So it's something to consider. And last but not least, SaaS alternatives. It's not really the opposite of open source, but on some occasions, companies will prefer the SaaS managed solution because it saves them time, right? Time to manage the software, to integrate, and dev enablement shifts from DevOps dependency to a cloud lock scenario that in the overall trade-off is worthwhile. And SaaS popularity is likely only to rise as organizations shift more and more resources to the cloud. So to sum things up in regards to adopting open source, there is no really right or wrong when it comes to the adoption. It's a matter of perspective, and there are multiple factors to consider. So you should choose what's best for your needs. And speaking of your needs, how do we choose an open source project, right? Because maybe I Googled my use case, I found 2-3 projects. How do I know which one is the most suitable one for me? So we have some questions that we can ask ourselves and found the answers. And based on these questions, we can know and choose the open source project that is right for our needs. So these questions are revolving popularity, activity, security, readiness, documentation, ecosystem, ease of use, and roadmap. So let's cover each one. Popularity. Does the project has a high count of GitHub stars? If so, it could be a good indication that it is a popular project. Is the project part of CNCF or incubator? Because if so, it gives you like a signature that is this project follows high quality standards, which can lead to a popularity of this project. You should go Google the project alone to check for online presence, but you should also Google it versus similar products to check for reviews. Next up is activity. Check the commits rate. Are they daily, weekly, monthly? How many issues are there? How many releases are there? Is the project maintained by one developer or more? Does the project have sponsors, companies that believe in the future of this project and willing to invest money in order to see the project come more to life and be more active and more robust? So all of these questions are meant for you to understand that if you will incorporate this project and you will wait for a bug fix or a feature, how long should you need to wait in order to get those? So it's a very important thing to check. Security. So check for known vulnerabilities and supply chain considerations. I also put a link here for tools to checking security risk open source dependencies. So security is very much needed consideration. We see supply chain companies and products emerge more, I think, in the last year. So it is very, very important to check, because it could be like the make it or break it kind of thing for your environment if you incorporate a tool that has issues. So make sure you involve security in your considerations as well. Readiness. Is the project declared as production ready, like Keda that I mentioned? Are the current features enough to sustain usage? And is my use case covered fully in the current state? And if not, am I okay with it? Because if not, maybe I can keep tabs and wait for the next version to come out. And maybe this version will be in more ready state for me to use. And then it will be better for my use case and for my environment. Documentation. So documentation is basically the gateway for the project, because you don't know anything about this project. So, and this documentation is like the gateway for you to understand what the project is all about, how to integrate known issues and explanations about the features. So if the documentation is rich and cover most aspects, then it will be really helpful for you both to integrate and to use it in a daily basis. Ecosystem. So I think it's very, very, or almost the most important metric here to consider, because this is the metric that will help you in your day-to-day maintenance. And I will explain. In one of my previous companies, I used Rundeck as the CI tool. And at that time, Rundeck wasn't quite mature. The documentation wasn't great. And the ecosystem was very small. So when I had to incorporate new functionality or enhance some flows, it was very hard for me back then, because again, the documentation wasn't great and I didn't have people to reach out to and ask for help. As opposed to that, in other company that I worked for, we used Jenkins as the CI tool. You can say a lot of things about Jenkins, but it has a very large ecosystem. So if the project that you're considering, the users are engaged on GitHub, and maybe also the project has a dedicated community channel like Slack, Telegram, Discord, or any other, it will really help in your day-to-day, because if the integration is hard or complex, but the ecosystem is very large, then you will know that in your day-to-day maintenance, it will be easier enough, because you will have community to rely on to reach out for help. But not only that, community that is big means that a lot of users are using this tool, which means a lot of use cases are already covered. So it's a very important thing to know in your day-to-day for your day-to-day maintenance. And last but not least, is the project defined as an open source project or plan to go towards monetization? Because if it is planned to go towards monetization, it means that it will shift from open source to closed source. We all know what that means, so we need to consider that. And we also need to check features planning. So if the project has features planning, it means that the project is well thought of. They have, like, same as work, right? We have roadmaps, we have things and vision for our project. So if this vision is communicated in the project's public eyes, it means that it has a future. It will perceive as one to be more active in the future, which is good to know, especially if we're going to integrate it in our production environment. So I covered a lot of questions here and metrics of how to choose an open source project. So in order to sum this up, ask the general questions to cover the basics and check if the project is in a ready enough state to incorporate generally, but also ask the tailored specific questions to cover your use case and your pain points. So for example, if you have a heavy use case, then you should focus and really rely on the documentation and ecosystem metrics. And if you don't have capacity for maintenance, for example, then you should focus and put more weights on the readiness and ease of use metrics. Do a POC, see how well it gets integrated in your environment, and rely on your research ecosystem to the rescue. Engage in GitHub, raise issues, and contribute for the project success and eventually your success. And yeah, I think that's that. And another thing, like a small token for me, if you want to contribute to the open source realm without writing a single line of code because you don't have the time to do it, or you're not really a dev person per se, then there are other ways you can contribute to open source. So you can open issues, bug fixes, or feature requests. That way you contribute to the project robustness and for its future. Modify documentation. So documentation is skill. So if you have the skill, please utilize it in order to make the documentation much more readable and clear and concise. As I showed you, it's also a metric to choose an open source project. So maybe because of you, someone will choose this open source project. So if you have the skill, please leverage it. Everyone will thank you for that. Share your use case and write blog posts about open source projects that you know about or used. For example, I helped incorporate an open source tool called a script server in my previous job with my team member. It's an open source tool for exposing Ansible playbooks and Terraform code through UI with permissions set up as well. So it's an awesome tool in my opinion. So I shared it in a blog post and hopefully people will read it and maybe see that it's good for their use case and that's what, and then will adopt it as well. Share tools that you found with colleagues and techie friends. It's also good for them to know. A company or individual sponsorship. So as you know, projects that are not backed up by companies sometimes really need the money in order to keep maintaining this project. So if you're able to contribute some money or help convince your company to invest in sponsorship of open source projects, then it will be a blessing. Hold an open source mindset. So aim to incorporate open source projects wherever possible and reasonable, because if I do it and I share it with other team members or other people in my company, maybe this will make them think about open source as well, and they will get inspired by that mindset and maybe adopt it as well. And last but not least, spread the word on open source at conferences like I'm doing just now. So that's it. I hope that you enjoyed it. I think that we have time for Q&A. If so, just I'm here for you. Thank you so much.
Hello again, Hila. Thanks for the awesome talk.
Thank you.
Hope you had fun. You certainly looked like you did.
Yeah, I really like open source. I like speaking about it. I really think it's a very important realm to both contribute to and be part of. So yeah, I really enjoy it.
Yeah, I could see the fire in your eyes. That's why I asked. Okay. So you're ready for some questions?
Yeah.
So first one would be, would you recommend OSS adoption for startups in order to reduce budgets?
Yes, there is no anything that prevents startups from adopting open source. As I showed you, since your startup, maybe you don't have time or capacity for maintenance, then you can just put the weights on the metrics that I showed that will help you adopt an open source project that is quite mature and wouldn't require you to have too much maintenance in your day-to-day, and that way you will benefit from all worlds, both covering your use case and not need to have too much maintenance in your day-to-day. So definitely.
It depends, like so many things.
Yeah, but I
So
work the script server, the tool that I incorporated, it was in a startup and people used it, all was good. It actually enabled the developers to do their own thing without having to rely on us too much. So it is totally possible. Of course, the grain of salt is that you need to check things and really know what you're going towards to. That's why I have all these metrics to make sure that you know exactly what you're introducing to your environment. But overall, yeah, it can be done, and it can be done in a good way.
all right, thanks for that. We got another question for you. Do you have any ideas of how to make open source license handling easier? I would like template projects that you can start from that is reviewed by lawyers in advance. Many GitHub projects doesn't follow the obligations according to the dependencies they use.
Okay, so I personally have less experience with the open source licensing, but I can, if this person will reach out, I can connect him to other people that are more involved in open source licensing stuff, so they can reach out to them. And also, I'm sure that if this person will post about it in certain projects or in communities, people will be more than happy to help. So I currently have less experience in this area, but I can help offline with connecting to other people who can help.
Yeah, you already shared your contact information, so just hit Hila up. She is, as you have heard, she's happy to help if you got some more questions. So another one, you are senior DevOps engineer. Maybe you want to elaborate a bit on how do you become a DevOps engineer in the first place?
Sure. So my background is being a system admin. Then I switched to DevOps, which basically means that we are no longer, collide with developers. We want to enable them to do their jobs. So DevOps is much more than tools. It's a mindset. So once you have this mindset, yeah, you can learn some tools, but the most important thing is the culture. So if you are willing to change your ways, the old ways of system admins where we say no and we want to say only yeses, then the transition will be much easier. In terms of tools, then yeah, cloud providers that are out there, AWS, GCP are the most known ones. Azure tools, Terraform for infrastructure as code, Ansible or Chef or Puppet for configuration as code, Jenkins, Circle CI for CI, monitoring, Prometheus, Grafana. So I think the most the greatest tip I can give you in this transitioning is to create a project of your own, because you don't have the experience in a work environment. So create a project of your own of a robust system with all the moving parts of monitoring, CI/CD, performance, and all of these kind of things. And then you can speak about this project in interviews. And even though you don't have the work experience, you will show the employers that A, you have the passion, that's why you worked on it on your free time, and B, you can defend the decisions that you made during this project, and then they will see that you have the necessary knowledge and intentions when it comes to building systems.
All right, and maybe apart from all the information you gave us, do you have any go-to resources that you maybe also used in your process of becoming DevOps engineer? Like books, blogs, I don't know, YouTube channels maybe?
It's been 4 or 5 years since then, so I don't remember specific ones. But in general speaking, I can say that the book of Google of SRE is good because it really explains the principles of being an SRE. Some companies have separate positions for SRE and DevOps, because DevOps is more about the automation and DevOps and dev enablement, as opposed to SRE, which is much more about site reliability and making the system more reliable and resilient. Some companies have this two jobs merged, some don't. So it's good to know this aspect as well, because as I explained in my talk, the system and the environment stability is the most important thing for us. So this book is good. O'Reilly's books are very, very good for anything. So there are books for Prometheus and Terraform and Ansible, so a lot of things. These books are very good to learn a specific tool, but they have books for design and architecture in general as well. And there are people that you can watch online. So I don't recall something out of the top of my head, but there is a Twitter thread that I can share with a lot of recommendations of people to watch out for, and like I don't want to say influencers, but people that are have a tendency to communicate their work more frequently, and you can follow them and be up to date of what's going on with this industry.
Right, thanks for that. Maybe a bit off-topic question, but nevertheless maybe interesting for some folks. What kind of music do you play in your band, and more importantly, where can I listen to it?
So my go-to music is pop rock. So we covered songs like Muse, Alanis Morissette, Radiohead. So this is my favorite music. Of course, there are other band members that have different kind of music that they like. So we also switch it up a bit. And there is a playlist of my concert. I can share it with you, and you can share it with the people or in the chat, whatever you think is best. And if you watch it, it will be awesome.
Yeah, I will certainly listen to it. Just share this playlist, and we will share it in the chat.
Awesome.
All right, Hila, thank you so much for the talk. Thank you so much for joining and sharing all this awesome information with us. Hope you have a nice rest of the day, and goodbye. Till next time.
Bye, people. Enjoy the rest of the conference.